They were just a very reserved family who mostly kept to themselves. But nothing seemed to go right for the Stouties.
Literally, one Stouty member after the other seemed to be passing away.
This family is cursed, or something's going on here.
There's even more horror waiting around the bend.
Is it bad if you argue with your kids and tell them you'd be better off if you kill yourself?
That's just unreal. Except it happened right here.
It just kept getting crazier and crazier.
It's the perfect weapon. You can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it.
Why did you take her to the hospital?
I didn't want another one to die in the house.
And why is that?
Because houses are nasty after somebody's died in it.
It's an old, quiet neighborhood. We all look out for each other. It's actually considered part of the Bible Belt. We feel safe here.
Easter Sunday, we received a 911 call about a male subject that was not breathing. It's a stressful situation. You go in, of course, with the mindset of doing whatever you can to save them. When we arrived on scene, we discovered a 61-year-old Mark Stouty. Mark was in the hallway of the residence and paramedics were performing CPR. But unfortunately, he passed away. His wife, Diane Stouty, is the one that placed the 911 call.
Diane tells medical emergency responders that her husband had flu-like symptoms leading up to that day.
But Mark was adamant that he did not want to go to the doctor. She also told us about several prior medical issues that he had, including heart issues and diabetes. There was nothing in the home that stood out as really being suspicious, but the behavior of the family was a little odd. Their children were playing games and just did not really seem overly concerned or bothered by their father being passed away. There did not seem to be a lot of emotion. And even at one point, Diane stepped over Mark's body, which we thought was strange. But people grieve differently, and you don't know what somebody's experiencing and going through.
I met the Stouties at the Redeemer Lutheran Church. I was like 8 or 9 when I first was introduced to them. They were just a very reserved family who mostly kept to themselves. There was Diane and Mark. Sean was the older brother. Sarah was the older sister. Then there was Rachel, and then Brianna was the youngest. She was around 10.
The Stouties were one of the central families at Redeemer. They seemed like a very happy family. And we would see Sarah and Brianna here and there at church. Sean was always in tow with Mark. Diane and Rachel were in the praise band, and I stood next to them playing the bass. Diane kind of ran the show. She was a registered nurse, and she was the main breadwinner for that family.
Diane would never really talk about her home life or her career. It was pretty much all about music within the church. She could be a little bit territorial about the church organ. She very much felt like it was hers. Those who were part of the music at the church knew she had her odd quirks, but found her to be quiet but kind and personable.
Mark was more of a stay-at-home father and kind of bring in a little money here and there playing music with his band.
Me and Mark, we really hit it off the very first day that we met. I couldn't ask for a better front man. He was just inspirational. Every time I got with him, I would just smile. He was one in a million. You just don't find that kind of person every day. He became a real good friend of mine. We hung out a lot. But the band life and his home life was totally two different things. For some reason, he just never invited me into his house. Mark showed up at my house, and it was so strange. He was looking at me, and he just slid down my door. And this guy had a yellow tint to his skin. He was pale. I never seen a person that pale before in my life. I kept asking him, "Are you okay?" "I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm just drunk." "No, Mark, that's not drunk." "I promise you, man, I'm okay. I'll just go back home." So he starts his car, and I mean, he just floors it. I got in my van, and I followed him, and he drove back to his house. I pulled in, and he was getting out, and he just kind of leaned back against his car, you know. I go, "Mark, you need to go to the hospital. There's something wrong with you. It's not alcohol. There's something else wrong with you."
The medical examiner didn't find anything unusual about Mark's condition. There wasn't any trauma, there wasn't any injuries, just a dry ring of blood around his mouth they concluded could have happened throughout the process of conducting CPR.
Based upon Mark's prior health issues, the medical examiner determined that Mark passed away of natural causes. No autopsy was performed on Mark, and shortly after, Diane had him cremated.
The tragedy of Mark's death would have been hard for any family, but nothing seemed to go right for the Stouties.
We received another shocking 911 call from Diane Stouty.
It's the worst call a mother can possibly make.
We saw the police cars and the coroner's van. We're standing here in total shock. You don't know someone might be ill. You don't know if someone's suicidal, if they have enemies. So you're very, very curious.
Sean was found in his bedroom. He was on the ground and was not breathing. He was very frail, curled up almost in the fetal position. Paramedics determined that he was deceased.
I was like, what in the world is going on?
It's a tragedy for Diane. She's lost her husband and now her eldest son. Something's off here.
We're standing here in total shock. You have got to be kidding me.
When we spoke with Diane, she said that Sean had been sick for several days, had been experiencing flu symptoms, heavy vomiting.
She explained that she checked on him before she went to church, and when she got back is when she discovered he wasn't breathing.
He had a ring of blood that was around his mouth, but he had been vomiting a lot, so it was just kind of attributed to that. There was really nothing suspicious or nefarious. She told us Sean was autistic and he had a seizure disorder. It wasn't that she was expecting him to pass, but there were some health problems that he had. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy, it was concluded that Sean did pass of natural causes.
To think about losing my husband and then a few months later losing a child would be so devastating. And I don't know how Diane could live through that. I just strongly felt that I needed to express my sympathies. So I went over and rang the doorbell. And I said to Diane, I just wanted to check and see if you are okay. And she said, oh, my son died. Just like that. What? I was overwhelmed. I remember standing there wiping tears from my eyes talking to her because my heart was broken for her. I asked, are you going to have a funeral or a service or something? And no, we're not going to do that. Okay. I felt like she was in shock and just wasn't able to deal with it yet.
After the death of Mark and Sean, Diane's life didn't change. She just kept going to work, kept going to church.
The church was her work-life balance. Diving into that head first was her only outlet.
You'd only ever see Diane and Rachel at church playing the organ, playing flute in the band. Sarah and Brianna really never came anymore. I remember seeing Rachel after the death of Sean, and I kind of gave my condolences to her, and she kind of just brushed it off like, thanks, we're doing okay.
They were always buddy-buddy. They talked a lot in the back row, laughing.
They never really would go anywhere without each other.
I think Diane really just saw a lot of herself in Rachel.
Rachel was extremely musically talented. She was very intelligent.
Sarah, for the most part, demonstrated pretty fair learning abilities. She went to college. But with Rachel being obviously the golden child, it would have been difficult for Sarah.
Brianna, the youngest child, who was 10, had an educational plan, which typically denotes that there is some kind of deficiency there.
Rachel was the only one that Diane saw have any type of potential. And I think with that type of potential, you rally a little bit more behind that child and you leave the others behind.
I started my shift in the medical ICU. A young lady came in with multi-system organ failure. It was very weird. I never seen any case like that. Her condition was very, very critical.
I was shocked. There was a prayer request in the church. We were told that Sarah was sick and in the hospital, and we're praying for her recovery.
My first reaction was, this family is cursed, or something's going on here.
Sarah was in a coma and was on life support. I was worried because she was so close to dying.
Doctors can't seem to figure out what's wrong with Sarah. They've run test after test, did blood work, and can't seem to find out why she is sick as she is. You've got a tragedy after tragedy happening in one household in the span of a year. Something's not adding up.
It appeared that Sarah was going to pass away as well. And I started thinking, is this more heinous than what you want to think about? I researched anything that I could find about the family. I reviewed the death reports from both Mark and Sean and just discovered a lot of red flags that were starting to appear. I wanted to go down to the hospital and speak with Sarah's doctors to get as much information from them as I possibly could.
I spoke with the kidney specialist, and we both agreed that it must be some sort of toxicity. We start thinking that this could be a case of poisoning.
When the doctor told me his fear of it potentially being a poisoning case, it was shocking. It's just such a crazy scenario. It really hit home when thinking about Mark and Sean and just the similarities. Flu symptoms and the extreme vomiting and their bodies shutting down just out of the blue. And then also with blood around their mouth. As each day went on, I am coming to the belief that, in fact, we could be dealing with a serial poisoning case. I'd become very worried for the other members of the family. The thought comes to mind, who is next?
I am Sarah Katrina Stouty. I had a brain bleed. Not many people survive that, but I survived. When I woke up from my coma, I felt like I was paralyzed. I thought I had died. I was like, where am I? My brain was kind of loopy. I was diagnosed with intracranial hemorrhage.
While Sarah was sick and in the hospital, Diane was playing the organ at church like always. She didn't seem agitated at all.
I continually stayed in contact with Sarah's nurse. She told me about some strange behavior with Diane that I'm extremely concerned about. She felt like Diane was not behaving how you would expect a mother to behave with having a child that was so ill. Diane was making jokes with some of the hospital staff, laughing, and even discussed taking a vacation and planned to leave Sarah behind.
It's absolutely insane to think about. Carrying on with life and you've got a child gravely ill, it starts raising eyebrows.
I felt like I had to interview her and figure out what was going on.
Is it Stout?
Stouty.
Stouty? Okay.
Going into the interview with Diane was extremely stressful. Other than just some odd behaviors, we had no evidence whatsoever of any type of wrongdoing.
How did all that come about with Sarah?
She started Saturday, she complained of a little headache, and her stomach was upset, and she threw up a couple of times. So I didn't think any about it until Sunday afternoon, and then I couldn't get her to wake up. She didn't respond to me, so we took her to the emergency room.
I felt it was strange Diane was almost bubbly.
You're in the medical field? Is that?
I'm a nurse.
You're a nurse? Okay.
But I'm a cardiology nurse. I know hearts, but
Yeah.
I wanted to essentially feed her ego, make her feel good about herself, make her feel like, she could open up with me.
Is there anything that you could think of that it could have been? Because obviously, from what we understand, you're pretty intelligent.
Yeah.
And this is.
I try.
Yeah.
But I really can't think of anything.
I went to change gears with her. I brought up the fact to her that I had been in touch with the medical examiner's office and that there would going to be some further tests done with the samples that were saved from Sean's autopsy.
What would be your explanation if there is some kind of chemical or something that shouldn't be there of that nature?
I really don't know.
If somebody was to harm him, why do you think that would be? What would be the reason for somebody to want to harm him?
I don't know about my kids, but Mark had a lot of weird friends. They were into drugs and all that.
Her tone changed. She went into how he was kind of out partying on the weekends with his bandmates, how he was kind of reckless in terms of drinking and smoking and even some drug usage. But I never found anything whatsoever that indicated that Mark was involved in anything like that. So I've decided to take a religious angle and see if that would maybe induce her to speak more openly with me.
I know that you are a God-fearing woman. You're somebody that knows, about the right thing and about God's way. Mm-hmm. And I think you're a very good lady. With the right intentions, right? You try. And oftentimes the best way to ask for forgiveness is to talk about it.
Sarah's a difficult child to deal with.
I understand.
And I've been kind of putting pressure on her to, you need to get out and get a job. After all, you get tired of doing everything for your kids, and it's like you need to step up and do it.
A lot of things start unraveling before our eyes. It's not the happy home that it presents itself to be on the outside. There's actual turmoil. Maintaining the home and maintaining a steady income was a lot of stress for Diane.
My family was chaotic. My brother was autistic. My youngest sister, Brianna, had learning disabilities. And of course, there's me with mental illness. It was a little overwhelming.
You got so much stress and pressure on you. There's only so much a person can take. It's not about evil. It's not about just being bad. There's a reason.
Well, is it bad if you argue with your kids and tell them, and I probably shouldn't have, it's like sometimes you'd be better off if you'd kill yourself.
It's just all very matter of fact. She's a complete sociopath.
It just kept getting crazier and crazier.
I know Sean and Sarah were very close.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, they talked a lot together. And to put it really short and sweet, I knew they were drinking antifreeze.
What?
Diane, you and I both know why you knew they were drinking antifreeze. You knew, Diane, that they were drinking antifreeze because you were giving it to them.
And I didn't know what else to do.
Inside, my heart was pounding. I'm sure my pulse was through the roof. This is an antifreeze poisoning case. However, I had to keep my poker face on to get her to make a full confession.
Who's the first person that you killed?
Mark.
Mark was the first one. Why didn't you call an ambulance or bring him to the hospital at that point?
Because by then I hated his guts.
She probably got tired of my dad's behavior. Instead of divorcing him, she took the other choice, and that's to kill him. I was really sad.
How did stuff get started with Sean?
Sean would be interfering with whatever I would do. Both Sean and Sarah would just trash the house. They would do whatever they wanted to do and never helped.
My mom, I think she may have snapped.
Why the antifreeze?
Yeah. I mean, it sounded easy and it didn't sound, you know, it wouldn't burn. You know, cleaners burn, acids burn.
It's the perfect weapon. Nobody suspects that this substance would eventually kill you because you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it.
And what were you putting it in?
Coca-Cola.
How much would you put in?
Just a little bit.
You wouldn't believe the script if somebody handed it to you. It truly is crazy to think that you're at home with your wife or your mother and they kindly bring you a drink and having no idea that your drink is antifreeze.
It's not an instant death. It's a slow, painful process. She was a nurse. To watch them get sick and eventually die, who does that?
So if you can stand up for us, we have to put some handcuffs on you. We're not gonna put them on tight, but I have to have you put your hands behind your back.
Formalities.
Yeah, it is.
God, we were able to arrest her before any of her other children could be harmed. To convict Diane of murder, we need concrete evidence.
So we searched the Stouty residence.
It was amazing. You could tell that there was something big happening. It was like the nightly news. I saw Rachel and Brianna sitting on the front step. There was this look in their eyes. It was just dark. I thought, where is their mother?
We went through everything. Trash cans, mail, phones, laptops.
And then we located a 6-pack of Coke that was out on a workbench. And next to the 6-pack of Coke was a bottle of antifreeze. This goes right in line with what Diane just told us. It was just huge.
In a murder case like this, you don't want to leave any stone unturned, so we systematically searched all the rooms. Then we searched Diane's bedroom. Hidden between books and folders on a shelving unit, we came across a shocking piece of evidence which took the case in a totally crazy other direction.
This piece of evidence turned out to be Rachel's journal. And in the journal, she wrote, "It's sad when I realize how my father will pass on in the next 2 months and how Sean, my brother, will move on shortly after. And yet it's really helpful. I'm being warned so that I have more time to prepare and cope. Also, I get to have Dad's car when he's gone. It'll be tough getting used to the changes, but everything will work out. Mama and Papa God will make sure of it." A very chilling statement. She knows that her father and brother are getting ready to be murdered. It was a huge twist in the case. I had to get Rachel in.
Hey, Rachel. I appreciate you being willing to come down and speak with me. I just kind of have a few questions for you. Once you found out about what your mom did, what do you think about that?
Confusion, shock. Nobody expects to have somebody that they know do that. A bit scared of who would be next.
Her behavior was strange. It was not the response that one would think they would get.
We see a lot of Diane in Rachel. Body mannerisms, movements, the way they describe things. It's as though Rachel is a carbon copy of Diane.
Do you recognize this?
Yeah, I remember this.
Okay. What is that?
Little journal thing.
A journal thing? Whose journal?
Mine.
You could see that the wheels started turning quickly in her mind of how am I going to explain this.
I've had a lot of really bad dreams about them dying. I talked to Mom about it. And she mentioned she was thinking of hurting them.
Okay. Rachel, whose idea was this?
Mom brought it up, and we discussed
What'd she say to you?
that it would be quick, that it'd be easy, that they'd be to heaven soon, and we could move on.
To think that not just a mother, but now a mother and her daughter are carrying out these acts together, it's just unthinkable.
Why did you guys want to kill them?
Dad was basically a drain on her, on us. Sean, we argued on a lot because I still think we could have put him in a assisted living, but she wanted him out.
I believe that Diane was probably the one that spearheaded a lot of what took place, but there's zero doubt that Rachel was a willing accomplice.
You know, when Sarah got so bad, you know, you thought that she was pretty much dead, but why did you take her to the hospital?
I didn't want another one to die in the house.
And why is that?
Because houses are nasty after somebody's died in it.
It boggles the mind that somebody can wear all those masks, but really what's behind it all is true evil.
It's absolutely shocking. Here's a mother and daughter that would go to church, sing, play the organ, only to go home at night and start poisoning their family members.
How many times did you do it, Rachel?
3, 4 times. It was a trade-off. She would do it, then I would.
That goes beyond anything I think that anybody could even imagine.
They went in depth in their planning of how they would essentially take turns giving the antifreeze to the victims. It's just so crazy.
It's another level of mother and daughter relationship. These are partners in crime. And Diane's narcissism is what probably led her to recruit Rachel. They're just so eerily close that she grooms her.
Rachel was my mom's favorite. They're not disabled like the rest of the family.
They were each other's best friends. They were each other's lives.
I mean, was it all an act? What was the act? The church? Certainly, I think now in retrospect, we see that as being the act. And the real Stouty women is what was happening in the home. I mean, if you think about it, going to church and being devout, great cover for murder.
Just when I would think there's no way it could get any stranger. After I arrested Rachel, she had a purse with her. Inside, there was another journal that she had written.
There's even more horror waiting around the bend.
Inside Rachel's purse, I found a poem. And the last paragraph of the poem read, "Once upon a time there was 6, and then there were 3. Only the quiet ones will be left." They wanted to eliminate everybody else from their life and live together. There was more horror. They weren't done.
When were you guys gonna kill Brianna?
Sometime after Sarah.
And how are you gonna do that?
Well, she liked root beer.
When you include an 11-year-old child, the depravity knows no end.
It's awful. They wanted it to just be them.
Prosecutors say Rachel and her mother Diane used antifreeze to poison her father Mark and to poison her brother Sean.
Think about this community. It's a quiet, sleepy town that is littered with churches. When this news broke, it was a real gut punch.
We were absolutely blown away. That's just unreal. Except it happened right here.
It was hard to wrap my head around. It hurts because I trusted them.
The anticipation for the trial to start was palpable. When we see Diane in the courtroom, you think, how is this possible that someone so frail and fragile could be somewhat of a monster? When I saw Sarah enter the courtroom, you can't help but want to cry. All eyes were on her.
If Rachel hadn't been convicted of a crime, she would have gone to college and graduated and had a job. And I do forgive her for what she did.
I kind of felt sorry for her because she was an accomplice. I think that my mom may have told her what to do.
Rachel read an apology letter to Sarah. I don't think really anybody was expecting that.
I'm sorry that I couldn't find the courage to stand for what was right, to go for help, to protect you and our siblings. I was scared, but being scared is no excuse.
I remember thinking, bullshit. I really think she was trying to manipulate to get a lesser sentence.
A huge twist happens in the case. Rachel decides that she wants to testify against her mother.
Rachel was presented an offer that if she would testify, she could eventually have the opportunity for parole.
It's backstabbing at its finest. When all the cards were laid out on the table, it was every man for himself, and we saw the division of the pair.
My mother, she'd taken away my independence. I now live in group homes, and I have a guardian. I just wish I could live on my own, but I can't. Isaac, I miss him being my dad.
He kept yelling about his grandmother.
We found leg irons, a throwing star, a knife.
Sally, where are you? 5 o'clock. Wake up.
But as we got a little bit closer, we could see a human foot.
She's been murdered, and she's stuffed in a garbage can in the back of the house.
At 6:17 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet California house where nothing violent had ever happened, and by the time the receiver was lifted, the life on the other end of the line had already slipped out of reach, leaving behind a silence that would stretch for decades. A silence heavy enough to fracture a family, unsettle a town, and haunt a case file stamped with 2 words no investigator ever wants to write: cold case. The morning fog still clung to the streets like a low-lying bruise when the first patrol car rolled up, tires whispering over damp asphalt, red and blue lights washing across manicured lawns and white fences that had been built for safety, not for death. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, coffee forgotten on kitchen counters, as officers moved with the kind of urgency that feels both rehearsed and deeply wrong, the kind that signals something irreversible has already occurred. This was California in 1994, a place defined by sun and promise, now briefly swallowed by the kind of darkness people believed belonged somewhere else. Inside the house, the air was still, unnaturally still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No kicked-in door. The scene looked almost polite, almost staged, and that detail alone sent a quiet alarm through the minds of the first responders. Violence, when it happens, usually leaves a mess. This one had not. And that was the first thing that didn't make sense. The victim was young, known, ordinary in a way that should have guaranteed safety. A routine life. A predictable schedule. The kind of person coworkers described as reliable, neighbors described as friendly, and friends described as someone who always answered the phone. That morning, the phone rang unanswered. By afternoon, the absence had become too loud to ignore. By evening, the word "missing" had begun to circulate, soft at first, then louder, then impossible to contain. Police started where they always do: timelines, last sightings, last conversations. Someone had seen the victim the night before, nothing unusual, nothing alarming. A quick stop at a familiar place. A short drive home. No reports of arguments. No threats. No enemies. The kind of clean personal history that investigators secretly dread, because it offers nothing to grip onto, nothing sharp enough to cut through the fog. Within hours, the case stopped being private. Squad cars lined the street. Detectives moved through the house with cameras and gloves, cataloging every object, every surface, every faint trace of disturbance. Drawers were opened. Closets searched. Trash bags sealed and labeled. And still, the scene refused to speak. No weapon. No clear point of entry. No obvious motive. Just a body, a locked-in silence, and a growing sense that whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. Outside, the community gathered in clusters, whispering theories that shifted with every passing minute. A burglary gone wrong. A secret relationship. A stranger passing through. California in the mid-90s was already on edge, saturated with crime headlines and courtroom dramas, and this case slid perfectly into the public imagination, feeding the fear that safety was an illusion and danger didn't need an invitation. Detectives worked through the night, their notebooks filling with names that led nowhere, their questions circling back on themselves. They interviewed coworkers, friends, neighbors, delivery drivers, anyone whose path might have crossed the victims in the last 48 hours. Everyone seemed shocked. Everyone had an alibi. Everyone insisted they had noticed nothing unusual. And that, too, became part of the mystery. Then came the evidence sweep, the slow, methodical process that turns a home into a grid of possibilities. Fibers lifted. Samples taken. Surfaces swabbed. In 1994, DNA analysis was still a developing promise, powerful but limited, its potential not yet fully realized. Investigators collected what they could, sealed it away, and hoped that science would someday catch up with the questions they couldn't yet answer. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The headlines softened, then disappeared altogether, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher shocks. But inside the department, the file grew thicker, heavier, burdened with unanswered questions. Tips came in, most of them useless. Sightings reported, then debunked. Suspects floated briefly to the surface, then sank under scrutiny. Each dead end tightened the knot of frustration. For the family, time moved differently. Every unanswered call, every knock at the door, every late-night news segment reopened the wound. They learned the language of law enforcement, ongoing investigation, no suspects at this time, following all leads, phrases that sounded active but felt hollow. The house where it had happened became a monument to absence, a place where memory and grief coexisted in uneasy silence. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. New families moved in, unaware of the story beneath their feet. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes were transferred, relabeled, archived. The case was officially designated a cold case, a bureaucratic term that barely hints at the emotional temperature of unresolved loss. Cold didn't mean forgotten. It meant waiting. And somewhere, sealed in plastic, preserved by protocol and hope, a biological trace sat quietly, carrying an answer no one yet knew how to read. Because the truth about this case was never gone. It was only hidden, patient, and waiting for science to catch up. The waiting did not look dramatic from the outside, no sirens, no flashing lights, just boxes stacked on metal shelves in a climate-controlled room, evidence reduced to barcodes and inventory numbers, while the town above it kept breathing, kept growing. Kept pretending the story had ended when the headlines stopped printing it. But inside the department, the case never fully slept, it lingered in conversations whispered over stale coffee, in glances exchanged when a similar crime crossed a detective's desk. In the uneasy feeling that the person responsible had blended back into the rhythm of ordinary life without leaving a ripple. In the months after the funeral, investigators retraced the final day again and again, squeezing the timeline until it felt bruised. Morning routines. Afternoon errands. Evening habits. A short window appeared, narrow enough to be frightening, a gap where something had happened fast and clean, without witnesses, without noise loud enough to raise alarm. That window became the center of everything, a fragile frame holding the only moment where truth could still be hiding. They focused on access. Who knew the house? Who knew the schedule? Who could come and go without triggering fear? Friends were questioned until voices went hoarse. Co-workers were pulled into sterile interview rooms where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and silence did most of the talking. Ex-partners were scrutinized, timelines compared, phone records requested and re-requested. Each lead came with promise, and each promise collapsed under verification. Nothing stuck. The lack of forced entry continued to gnaw at the investigation. It suggested familiarity, trust, or confidence. Someone who didn't need to break in. Someone who wasn't afraid of being seen, or someone who knew they wouldn't be. That realization narrowed the circle and simultaneously made it more dangerous, because it turned suspicion inward, toward the people the victim had known, the people who had attended birthday dinners, exchanged holiday cards, shared casual conversations that now felt poisoned by hindsight. Then there were the items that felt wrong not because they were missing, but because they were still there. Jewelry untouched. Cash left behind. Electronics in plain view. This wasn't theft. This wasn't random. Whatever had happened had a purpose that didn't translate into an easy headline. And that purpose remained invisible, a shadow without a body. One detail refused to fade, a small, easily overlooked trace found during the original evidence sweep. It hadn't meant much at the time. In 1994, it couldn't. It was logged, labeled, and quietly filed away with 100 other fragments that might matter someday. Back then, someday was a word detectives used to comfort themselves when the present offered nothing. As weeks bled into months, pressure mounted. The family wanted answers. The community wanted reassurance. The department wanted resolution. Detectives worked longer hours, chased thinner leads, and felt the weight of expectation pressing down on every decision. Mistakes were feared more than inaction, because a wrong arrest would shatter what little certainty remained. So they hesitated. They double-checked. They waited. Media interest flickered back to life whenever a rumor surfaced, then died just as quickly when it proved hollow. Reporters camped outside police headquarters, microphones ready, asking the same questions phrased different ways, hoping for a crack in the official response. No new developments. The investigation is ongoing. We're confident the case will be resolved. Words spoken often enough to lose their meaning. Inside the house, time had stopped completely. The family left rooms untouched, afraid that moving an object might erase something important, some invisible clue that had yet to reveal itself. Photographs remained on the walls. Clothes stayed in closets. The absence became a presence, heavy and constant, shaping every conversation, every decision, every future plan that now had to account for a missing ending. As the first anniversary approached, detectives reviewed everything from the beginning. Old notes. Early assumptions. Initial interviews. They searched for bias, for moments where certainty had replaced curiosity. A few minor inconsistencies surfaced, nothing explosive, nothing actionable. Just reminders that memory is unreliable and truth rarely announces itself clearly. Eventually, the case slid quietly into the category no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. Active, but stalled. Open, but untouched. The kind of file that sat on desks like a reproach, daring someone to pick it up and try again. New cases demanded attention. Fresh crime scenes arrived with their own urgency. The city did not slow down for unsolved mysteries. Years passed. Technology advanced in ways that felt almost unreal compared to the mid-90s. DNA databases expanded. Cold cases across the country began to stir, revived by science that could extract stories from microscopic traces. Investigators watched these breakthroughs with cautious hope, wondering if their own silent boxes might one day speak. And then, quietly, almost without ceremony, the department began reviewing old cold cases for biological evidence that could be retested. It wasn't a promise. It was a possibility. Files were pulled. Inventories checked. Some cases had nothing left to offer. Others held samples that had survived time, contamination, and neglect. This one was among them. When the evidence was reopened, it felt less like reopening a case and more like disturbing a grave. Gloves snapped into place. Seals were broken. A sample, collected decades earlier without fanfare, was carefully prepared for analysis that hadn't existed when it was first stored. The lab work took time. Weeks stretched long. No one allowed themselves optimism. Hope had betrayed them before. Then the report arrived. Quietly. Clinically. A match where none had existed before. Not a name yet, not a face, but a profile. A genetic fingerprint that did not belong to the victim and did not belong in that house. It was the first solid thing the case had offered in years. Detectives stared at the result longer than necessary, as if it might dissolve under scrutiny. This was the moment every cold case waits for, the instant where possibility transforms into momentum. The profile was uploaded. Databases were checked. Nothing. No immediate hits. No registered offenders. No easy answers. But science had changed again. Investigative genetic genealogy had entered the conversation, controversial, powerful, and capable of doing what traditional methods could not. It offered a different path, one that didn't ask, who has committed crimes before, but instead whispered, "Who are you related to?" The decision to use it was not made lightly. Legal reviews followed. Permissions were granted. And then, slowly, deliberately, the genetic profile was released into a wider net, where distant relatives unknowingly carried pieces of the same story in their own DNA. Somewhere, miles away from the quiet California street where it all began, a computer flagged a partial match. Not close. Not obvious. But enough to begin building a family tree backward through time, branch by branch, name by name. The investigation, dormant for decades, inhaled sharply. And for the first time since 1994, the case moved forward. The family tree did not appear all at once, it emerged slowly, painstakingly, like an image developing in a darkroom, each new name sharpening the edges of possibility while introducing new questions that refused to stay quiet. Analysts worked in silence, tracing connections through public records, obituaries, birth certificates, marriages, deaths, all the invisible threads people leave behind without ever imagining they might one day point toward a crime scene. This was not guesswork, it was mathematics applied to bloodlines, probability narrowed by geography and time until the abstract became disturbingly specific. At first, the list was long. Dozens of names spread across states, across decades, people who had lived ordinary lives entirely unaware that a fragment of their genetic code had just been drafted into an investigation frozen since the mid-90s. Detectives studied maps, overlaid timelines, highlighted those who had been in California in 1994, those whose ages fit, those whose movements intersected with the victim's final hours. One by one, the field began to shrink. What remained was a cluster of possibilities that shared more than DNA. They shared proximity. Employment histories placed them within driving distance of the neighborhood. Old addresses overlapped with familiar streets. Nothing criminal yet, nothing obvious, just a growing sense that the answer had always been closer than anyone realized. Investigators approached the process with caution, aware that this kind of method could feel invasive, even unsettling. Every step was documented, reviewed, justified. The goal was not suspicion for its own sake, but clarity. They were not chasing ghosts anymore. They were following math. One name began to surface repeatedly, not as a certainty, but as a gravitational center around which the data quietly bent. Age appropriate in 1994. Lived in California at the time. No criminal record worth noting. The kind of life that leaves no headlines behind it. A life that, on paper, gave nothing away. Surveillance began without announcement. Nothing dramatic. No sudden arrests. Just careful observation. Where they worked. Where they went. Who they spoke to. How they moved through the world decades after the night that had stopped time for someone else. There was no visible panic, no obvious guilt. If this person was the answer, they had worn the disguise of normalcy flawlessly. Detectives requested discarded DNA, the final step needed to turn probability into certainty. A coffee cup left behind. A napkin. Something ordinary, something forgettable. The kind of object no one imagines could betray them. The lab comparison took days. Those days felt longer than years. When the results came back, the match was not partial. It was exact. The same genetic signature found in that silent house in 1994 now belonged to a living, breathing individual who had built an entire adult life on top of a secret no one else knew existed. There was no celebration. No victory speech. Just a heavy stillness as detectives absorbed what the data confirmed. The truth had waited patiently, and now it demanded to be acknowledged. Before any action could be taken, investigators returned to the old case file with fresh eyes. They reread interviews, re-examined alibis, reconsidered details that had once seemed insignificant. Small moments lit up differently now. A vague statement. An imprecise memory. A time estimate that didn't quite align. None of it had stood out before. Now it formed a pattern. The suspect had been questioned early in the investigation, just another name on a long list, cleared without suspicion, allowed to drift back into anonymity. At the time, there had been nothing to hold them. No evidence. No motive. No reason to press harder. The system had done what it was designed to do, and in doing so, had unknowingly let the truth walk away. Confronting that reality brought no comfort. It only sharpened the stakes. This was no longer about solving a mystery. It was about correcting time. The arrest plan was deliberate, controlled, designed to minimize risk and maximize clarity. Officers rehearsed the approach, anticipating every possible reaction, every possible denial. They knew that decades of freedom can build confidence, even arrogance. Or it can build fear so deeply embedded that it never surfaces at all. When the moment came, it arrived without spectacle. No high-speed chase. No shouting. Just a knock at the door of an ordinary residence, in an ordinary neighborhood, under an ordinary sky. The suspect answered calmly, unaware that 30 years had just collapsed into a single instant. The words were delivered carefully. "You are under arrest. For a crime committed in 1994. The reaction was minimal, almost subdued, as if the meaning of the sentence required time to travel from sound to understanding. There was no confession. No dramatic outburst. Only a quiet shift in posture, a subtle acknowledgement that the past had finally caught up. News of the arrest broke fast. Headlines exploded with disbelief. Cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Stunning arrest. The community reacted in waves: shock, relief, confusion. A name they didn't recognize. A face they had never noticed. The idea that someone capable of such violence could live unnoticed among them for decades unsettled something fundamental. But as the story surged back into public view, investigators remained cautious. An arrest was not an ending. It was a beginning. Evidence would be challenged. Methods questioned. Memories tested under oath. And beneath the noise, one truth remained inescapable: science had opened a door that could never be closed again. For the family, the news arrived like a jolt to the nervous system. A suspect. A name. A possibility of answers. But also a reminder of everything that had been stolen: years, futures, certainty. Closure was promised often in true crime stories. Rarely did it arrive cleanly. As the legal process began to grind forward, a question hovered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If the answer had been there all along, waiting in a box, how many other stories were still frozen in time, waiting for the same quiet revolution to wake them? The past had not changed. But it had finally been heard. The interrogation room was smaller than memory had preserved it, a square of muted walls and humming lights where time felt compressed, decades folding inward as the suspect sat across from detectives who were younger than the case itself. The air carried none of the chaos people expect from arrest scenes, only the low static of inevitability. This was not a man dragged screaming from the past. This was someone gently escorted back into it. Questions came slowly at first, calibrated, almost polite. Name. Date of birth. Employment history. The answers were smooth, practiced, the responses of someone who had answered these questions their entire life without consequence. When the year 1994 surfaced, there was no visible flinch, no dramatic pause, just a brief tightening around the eyes that might have meant nothing at all. Detectives laid out the facts carefully, never rushing, never revealing more than necessary. They spoke of evidence. Of timelines. Of DNA. The word hung between them, heavier than any accusation. For a moment, the suspect said nothing, eyes fixed on the table, as if studying the grain of the wood for instructions. Then came the denial, soft and controlled, wrapped in the language of disbelief. This must be a mistake. I've never been there. I don't know that person. They had heard it before. Innocence sounds the same whether it is real or rehearsed. The interview ended without confession. That, too, was expected. Decades of silence do not shatter easily. The suspect was processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and led away, while investigators returned to the case file once more, now tasked with building something stronger than science alone. DNA could place someone at a scene. It could not explain why. Prosecutors entered cautiously, aware that this case would be scrutinized from every angle. Cold cases revived by genetic genealogy lived under a microscope, their methods questioned, their legality debated, their ethics dissected. Every document was reviewed. Every step was justified. The past was being judged by modern standards, and there would be no margin for error. As preparations for trial began, detectives sought to reanimate the story around the evidence. They revisited witnesses who had long assumed their role was over. Doors opened hesitantly. Voices, older now, tried to summon memories dulled by time. Some recalled small details they had never thought important. A car parked where it didn't belong. A conversation that ended abruptly. A sense of unease they couldn't explain back then. Not all memories returned cleanly. Some contradicted earlier statements. Others dissolved under pressure. Time had distorted everything, turning certainty into suggestion. Defense attorneys would later seize on these inconsistencies, framing them not as natural decay, but as doubt. The suspect's past was combed through with a precision that bordered on invasive. Employment records. Residential moves. Relationships. There were no prior violent offenses. No history that screamed danger. Instead, there was normalcy. Stability. A life built quietly, piece by piece, while one night in 1994 remained sealed off, unexamined, preserved in the dark. Media attention intensified as the court dates approached. The story was irresistible, a California cold case solved by DNA, a man arrested after decades of freedom. Commentators debated the power of science, the reach of surveillance, the thin line between justice and intrusion. The case became more than a murder investigation. It became a referendum on the future of policing. For the family, the noise was exhausting. Interviews reopened wounds they had spent years learning to live with. They wanted truth, not spectacle. Answers, not arguments. Every headline promised resolution. Every legal filing delayed it. In court, the evidence unfolded slowly, methodically. Experts explained genetic matches in language designed to be understood by 12 strangers tasked with deciding guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Charts appeared. Probabilities were translated into certainty. The defense countered with questions about contamination, about databases, about consent. Doubt was their currency, and they spent it generously. The House returned to the center of the narrative, reconstructed through photographs and testimony. Jurors were asked to imagine the stillness, the absence of struggle, the precision of violence. They were asked to believe that someone who looked so ordinary could carry out something so final. As the trial progressed, the suspect remained composed, listening, taking notes, occasionally leaning toward counsel. There were no visible cracks. If remorse existed, it stayed hidden. If innocence was genuine, it carried a heavy burden. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered again, older now, shaped by years of unanswered questions. Some felt relief simply knowing the case had not been forgotten. Others feared that the truth, once declared, might not align with reality. The verdict loomed, suspended in a silence that felt familiar. The same silence that had settled over the street in 1994. The same silence that had followed the ringing phone. And beneath it all, one unsettling possibility refused to disappear. That even with an arrest, even with science, some mysteries do not resolve neatly. They only change shape. The jury deliberated behind closed doors, 12 strangers carrying 30 years of unanswered questions into a room where time once again slowed to a crawl. Outside, the courthouse hallways echoed with footsteps and murmured speculation, reporters refreshing feeds, families sitting in rigid silence, everyone waiting for a sentence that might finally give shape to the chaos that had begun in a quiet California house in 1994. Inside that room, the past was unpacked piece by piece. DNA charts lay beside faded photographs. Expert testimony competed with human doubt. Jurors wrestled with a strange imbalance. The evidence was modern, precise, mathematical, yet the crime itself belonged to another era, reconstructed through memories softened by age and grief. The gap between then and now felt uncomfortably wide. Some jurors leaned heavily on science. A genetic match this strong, this exact, felt immovable. Others lingered on absence, no eyewitness, no confession, no clear motive articulated beyond inference. They asked themselves the same question investigators had asked decades earlier: how does a life of apparent normalcy contain something this violent without leaving a trail? Hours stretched. Then days. The waiting became its own kind of torment. The family felt suspended between hope and fear, knowing that either outcome would carry its own weight. A guilty verdict would validate years of waiting but could never restore what was lost. An acquittal would reopen a wound that had never truly closed. When the jury returned, the courtroom rose as one. The verdict was read aloud, its words precise, its tone neutral, yet the impact rippled outward instantly. Guilty. The sound landed differently on everyone who heard it. For some, it was relief. For others, disbelief. For the accused, it was the end of a long disguise, the collapse of a life built beyond accountability. Sentencing followed weeks later, another ritual of measured language and controlled emotion. Prosecutors spoke of harm, of years stolen, of a family forced to grieve without answers. Defense attorneys spoke of doubt, of a life otherwise lived without violence. The judge listened, expression unreadable, then imposed a punishment that acknowledged both the gravity of the crime and the time that had passed. When it was over, the room emptied slowly. There was no applause. No sense of triumph. Justice, when delayed this long, arrives muted. The family stepped outside into daylight that felt too ordinary for the moment. They spoke to cameras because they were expected to, not because words could contain what they felt. Closure, they said, was complicated. The community absorbed the outcome in stages. Some accepted it immediately, grateful that science had finally spoken. Others questioned it quietly, uneasy with a system that could reach so far back, pulling someone out of the present to answer for the past. Conversations lingered in cafes, on sidewalks, in online forums where certainty fractured into opinion. For law enforcement, the case became a symbol. Training sessions referenced it. Conferences discussed it. A once-forgotten file now stood as proof that time was no longer a shield. Cold cases everywhere felt suddenly less cold, their evidence boxes heavier with possibility. But amid the institutional pride, a quieter realization settled in. The system had failed once already. In 1994, the truth had been there, invisible but present, waiting for tools that did not yet exist. Justice had not been denied intentionally. It had simply been delayed by limitation. That distinction mattered, but it did not erase the years in between. The house where it happened no longer existed as it once had. Renovated. Sold. Reclaimed by new lives unaware of its history. Yet the story clung to the place, embedded in memory rather than wood and concrete. Some neighbors still avoided the sidewalk in front of it, guided by instinct rather than logic. As the headlines faded again, replaced by new stories, a lingering question remained, quieter now but no less powerful. How many other cases sat waiting, their answers sealed in envelopes marked evidence, their victims frozen in time by the limits of an earlier age? The case was solved, they said. But the echo it left behind suggested something else. That resolution does not erase the past. It only forces it to speak. In the weeks after the verdict, the world moved on with an efficiency that felt almost cruel. News cycles shifted. Courtroom benches emptied. The case that had once consumed decades was reduced to a paragraph in archives, a reference point in lectures, a statistic in presentations about the power of DNA. But for those closest to it, the ending did not behave like an ending at all. It lingered, restless, refusing to settle into something clean or final. The family returned home carrying a strange combination of validation and emptiness. The question of who had been answered, but the question of why remained suspended, untethered from any confession or explanation. Motive had been inferred, argued, speculated upon, but never truly spoken aloud by the person who mattered most. Silence, once again, claimed its place at the center of the story. Detectives who had worked the case at different stages felt the weight of hindsight pressed down on them. Some replayed early interviews in their minds, wondering if a different question, a longer pause, a harder push might have altered the timeline. Others reminded themselves that justice is shaped by the tools available at the time, that you cannot extract answers from science that does not yet exist. Knowing that did not make the years disappear. Within the department, the case sparked a broader reckoning. Old evidence rooms were audited. Forgotten boxes were reopened. Labels yellowed by time were replaced with fresh barcodes. Cold case units received renewed attention, their work reframed not as nostalgia-driven curiosity but as active, necessary pursuit. The past, it turned out, was still very much alive. Yet not every reopened case yielded answers. For every success, there were reminders of limitation, degraded samples, missing files, evidence lost to floods, fires, budget cuts, or simple human error. The California case stood as both inspiration and warning, proof of what was possible and of what had already slipped beyond reach. The convicted individual settled into a new routine defined by concrete walls and regulated hours. Appeals were filed, as they always are, arguing procedure, questioning technology, testing the strength of a verdict built decades after the fact. The legal language was dense, precise, detached from the human cost. Courts responded methodically. Motions were reviewed. Decisions were written. The machinery of justice continued its slow, grinding rotation. Public debate intensified in quieter spaces. Podcasts dissected the investigation. Comment sections filled with arguments about privacy, consent, and the reach of genetic databases. Some listeners celebrated the outcome as inevitable progress. Others worried aloud about a future where anonymity no longer existed, where family ties could become unintended evidence. The case had solved a crime, but it had also cracked open a philosophical door no one knew how to close. In the town where it all began, memory resurfaced in unexpected ways. A chance mention at a grocery store. A passing remark during a local news segment. Younger residents asked older ones about the story, piecing together fragments of a past they had never lived. The crime became part of the town's unofficial history, a cautionary tale whispered rather than taught. The house, despite its renovations, never fully escaped its shadow. Real estate listings avoided specifics. Neighbors spoke in careful half-sentences. The address remained searchable, tethered forever to a night that had rewritten its identity. Places, like people, absorb what happens inside them. As months passed, the initial sense of resolution softened into something more complicated. Justice had arrived, but it had arrived late, altered by time, filtered through layers of procedure and debate. It did not feel like a full stop. It felt like a comma. Because beneath the solved case, another truth waited quietly. That the past is never finished. That it watches, patient and intact. Until the present finds the courage, or the technology, to confront it. The appeal hearings unfolded without drama, conducted in rooms stripped of emotion, where the language of the law replaced the language of loss. Judges listened, nodded, asked narrow questions about procedure and precedent. The defense argued that time itself had contaminated the case, that memories had faded, evidence had aged, and technology had evolved faster than the rules meant to govern it. The prosecution countered with restraint, pointing back to the science, to the chain of custody, to the quiet certainty of a genetic code that did not forget. When the appeals were denied, there was no eruption of feeling, no public spectacle. Just a document filed, a decision rendered, a line drawn under an argument that had stretched for years. For the legal system, this was resolution. For everyone else, it was simply confirmation that the story would not be rewritten again. In the background, the detectives who had shepherded the case through its final years began to step away. Retirements came quietly. Desks were cleared. Names were removed from office doors. New investigators took their place, inheriting lessons learned the hard way. The cold case unit, once a quiet corner of the department, now carried a different energy, fueled by the knowledge that patience could be rewarded, that answers were not always gone, just delayed. Training sessions referenced the case not as a triumph, but as a timeline. A demonstration of how evidence outlives assumptions. Young officers listened as veterans described the frustration of the early days, the dead ends, the long silence, the moment when a sealed box finally spoke. The message was clear without being stated: do not discard what you do not yet understand. Beyond law enforcement, the ripple spread further. Families of other victims reached out, some hopeful, some cautious, some simply wanting acknowledgement that their stories still mattered. Cold cases that had been dormant for decades were pulled into the light, their evidence re-evaluated, their possibilities reconsidered. Not all would find answers. But none would be allowed to sleep unnoticed again. The community, having lived through the shock of resolution, began to absorb the story differently. It was no longer about fear. It was about proximity. The unsettling realization that the extraordinary can hide within the ordinary, that violence does not always announce itself with warning signs or visible fractures. Safety, they learned, is not guaranteed by familiarity. Conversations shifted from who had done it to how it had been possible. How someone could commit an act so final and then return to routine. How a town could host both normalcy and horror without recognizing the overlap. These questions had no clean answers. They lingered, unresolved, resisting closure. The family marked time differently now. Anniversaries that had once been defined by absence were reframed by acknowledgement. They visited the grave with a different posture, carrying the knowledge that the story had not ended in silence. It did not erase the years of waiting, but it gave them a shape, a boundary. Grief, once endless, became something they could finally see the edges of. Yet even as healing began, the past continued to surface in unexpected ways. A documentary request. A book proposal. A podcast episode seeking fresh angles on an old tragedy. Each inquiry reopened the narrative, threatening to turn lived pain into consumable content. The family learned to say no, to protect what little peace they had reclaimed. The case entered textbooks, cited in discussions about forensic evolution and ethical limits. Students studied it as an example, detached from the human cost, analyzing probabilities and procedures. It was strange to see a life reduced to a lesson, a tragedy transformed into a teaching tool. Necessary, perhaps. But unsettling all the same. And beneath all of it, the central truth remained unchanged. The crime had not been undone. The years had not been returned. The damage, once done, remained permanent. What had changed was something quieter, more fragile. The certainty that even the longest silence is not the same as being forgotten. As the years continued to roll forward, the case settled into a strange dual existence, both finished and unfinished at the same time. Officially, it was closed. Forms were stamped. Databases updated. The system declared its work complete. But closure on paper did not dissolve the residue it left behind, the faint static that lingered whenever the story resurfaced in conversation or memory. The family learned that resolution is not an event but a process, one that unfolds unevenly, without ceremony. Some days felt lighter, shaped by the knowledge that the truth had finally been named. Other days were unexpectedly heavy, burdened by the realization that no verdict could rewind time or restore what had been taken. Healing, they discovered, does not move in a straight line. In the broader world, genetic genealogy continued to advance, its reach expanding, its methods refined. More cold cases fell, one by one, each announced with the same familiar language: decades-old mystery solved, suspect identified through DNA. The California case became one among many, its uniqueness diluted by repetition, its impact absorbed into a growing narrative of scientific inevitability. But inevitability brought discomfort. Legislators debated limits. Privacy advocates raised alarms. Families of the accused questioned a system that could implicate someone through relatives who had never consented to be part of an investigation. The case was cited in hearings and opinion pieces, invoked as proof and as warning, depending on who was speaking. For law enforcement, the technology demanded discipline. Guidelines were drafted. Oversight increased. The power to reach backward into time came with a responsibility to move forward carefully. Every success carried the risk of overreach, every failure a reminder that science, like justice, is only as ethical as the hands that wield it. The town itself changed in subtler ways. New residents arrived, unaware of the street's history until curiosity led them down digital rabbit holes. Old residents grew accustomed to the occasional question, the hesitant glance toward a house that no longer looked like a crime scene but never fully escaped its reputation. The past remained accessible, searchable, impossible to fully bury. Memory, it turned out, was not static. It reshaped itself depending on who was remembering and why. For some, the case was a story about perseverance. For others, a cautionary tale about hidden violence. For the family, it was simply life, divided into before and after, stitched together by a long, aching middle. There were moments when the convicted individual attempted to re-enter the narrative, filing motions, granting limited statements through counsel, hinting at explanations that never fully materialized. Each attempt felt less like confession and more like negotiation with history, an effort to control the final shape of a story that had already hardened around them. The truth, however, no longer depended on words. It existed in records, in verdicts, in genetic code that could not be argued away. Silence, once a shield, had lost its power. And yet, even with answers in hand, an unease persisted. The case had shown how easily a life could vanish into uncertainty, how close justice had come to never arriving at all. It forced a reckoning with the randomness of resolution, the uncomfortable knowledge that many others would never receive the same ending. The California case did not promise fairness. It offered persistence. A reminder that some truths are not loud, not urgent, not immediate. They are patient, waiting for the world to catch up. And when it finally does, they leave behind a silence that feels different than before. With time, the case stopped being discussed in the present tense. People no longer said is being appealed or is under review. They said was, and in that shift of language, something subtle but permanent took hold. The story had crossed the threshold from active pain into historical fact, preserved not because it was resolved, but because it had endured. In academic journals and training manuals, the case was diagrammed and dissected. Flowcharts traced how a single biological fragment moved from a 1994 evidence bag to a 21st century conviction. Each step was analyzed, optimized, turned into protocol. The human faces attached to those steps faded into background, replaced by process and outcome. Progress demanded abstraction, even when abstraction felt like erasure. Cold case investigators elsewhere followed the pattern, hoping to replicate the success without repeating the mistakes. Some cases broke open quickly. Others resisted, offering only partial answers or none at all. The California case became a reference point, not a guarantee. A reminder that even with advanced tools, justice remains uneven, shaped by chance as much as effort. The family watched from a distance as their private history became public example. They learned to recognize their story stripped of names, told in passive voice, reduced to lessons learned and best practices. It was strange to hear their pain summarized in bullet points, but they understood the trade-off. If their loss could prevent another family from waiting decades for truth, then the exposure carried purpose. Within the community, the emotional temperature cooled. The fear that had once pulsed through the neighborhood softened into caution. The story was no longer whispered as a warning about danger lurking nearby, but shared as a reminder that evil does not always look like an outsider. It can wear familiar faces. It can pass through unnoticed. The house stood quietly, its history now an invisible layer beneath fresh paint and new routines. Children played nearby, unaware of the weight embedded in the ground. Life insisted on continuing, indifferent to memory, moving forward with or without permission. Occasionally, anniversaries prompted renewed attention. A local news segment. A retrospective article. Each revisit polished the narrative a little more, smoothing rough edges, clarifying timelines, reinforcing conclusions. With repetition, uncertainty shrank, even if it had never fully disappeared. Stories harden when they are told often enough. But there were those who still questioned. They revisited trial transcripts, challenged forensic interpretations, argued that justice delivered so late risks becoming injustice of another kind. Their voices were quieter, less visible, but they persisted, keeping doubt alive at the margins. Doubt, too, has endurance. For the convicted individual, time resumed its forward march under strict regulation. Days were measured, routines enforced. The outside world became distant, accessed only through filtered updates and legal correspondence. The night in 1994, once contained, now defined everything. And for the family, the most significant change arrived without announcement. One day, they realized they had gone hours, then days, without thinking about the case. Not because it mattered less, but because it no longer demanded constant attention. The story had finally loosened its grip. The cold case had been solved, yes. But its true legacy was quieter, more complicated. A testament to endurance. To the long arc of truth. And to the unsettling reality that some answers, once found, do not bring relief so much as acceptance. Acceptance arrived without ceremony, not as a wave of peace but as a gradual recalibration of expectation. The family learned to live with an answer that did not explain everything, with a verdict that closed a legal chapter but left emotional footnotes scattered everywhere. They stopped waiting for the moment when it would finally feel finished, understanding that some stories never truly conclude, they only become easier to carry. In the institutions shaped by the case, its influence persisted in less visible ways. Evidence handling protocols were rewritten. Preservation budgets were defended more aggressively. The idea that time could erase responsibility lost ground, replaced by the quiet understanding that every unsolved case was a question postponed, not dismissed. The past, it turned out, was not passive. It was observant. The story continued to ripple outward, intersecting with others in ways no one could have predicted. Investigators from different states reached out, comparing notes, sharing cautionary lessons learned in the California courtroom. Families of victims found a strange, fragile hope in the idea that waiting did not always mean forgetting. Even the skeptics acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted. Yet the case also forced a confrontation with limits. Not every crime leaves behind usable evidence. Not every truth survives intact. The success stories risked creating an illusion of inevitability, a belief that technology would eventually solve everything. Those closest to the work knew better. For every box that yielded answers, there were dozens that held only silence. The community, now further removed in time, began to remember the case less as a rupture and more as a marker. A point on a timeline that separated eras, before DNA could speak clearly, and after it learned how. The crime became less about fear and more about transition, a grim milestone in the evolution of justice. At the center of it all, the human cost remained unchanged. A life ended. A family altered. Years lost to uncertainty. No amount of scientific advancement could rebalance that equation. Progress could explain how the truth was found, but it could not justify the wait. The convicted individual's name receded from public conversation, replaced by broader themes and generalized lessons. Accountability had been assigned. Attention moved on. The story no longer required a villain to sustain it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence surrounding the case transformed. It was no longer the silence of ignorance or neglect. It was the silence of acknowledgement, of something fully seen and finally set down. The cold case had fulfilled its long trajectory, not by erasing pain, but by refusing to let it remain unanswered. And in that refusal, it left behind a final, enduring truth. That justice delayed is never ideal. Never complete. But when it arrives, even decades late, it still has the power to change how the past is remembered. Long after the paperwork was finalized and the case number retired, the story continued to exist in a quieter register, no longer urgent, no longer unfolding, but still present, like a scar that doesn't ache unless you press on it. It lived in small, unremarkable moments, a passing headline about another cold case reopened, a familiar street glimpse from a car window, a date on the calendar that still carried weight even when no one spoke its name out loud. For the family, life moved forward in increments. New routines formed. New memories layered themselves gently over old ones. The case no longer defined every conversation, but it remained woven into their understanding of time, a dividing line between who they had been and who they had become. They did not forget. They simply learned how to remember without drowning. In law enforcement, the case slowly transitioned from example to assumption. A generation of investigators entered the field having never known a world where DNA was uncertain or optional. For them, the idea of evidence waiting decades for its moment felt both obvious and astonishing. The California case became a quiet ancestor, its influence felt even when its details were no longer cited. The broader culture absorbed the lesson in fragments. True crime audiences grew, fascinated by the promise that mysteries could be solved, that the past could be interrogated indefinitely. But beneath the fascination lingered discomfort, an awareness that each solved case carried years of unresolved suffering behind it, years that could not be compressed into a satisfying ending. The house, the street, the town, all of it continued without acknowledgement of the weight beneath the surface. Time did what it always does. It softened edges. It blurred urgency. It allowed new stories to overwrite old ones. But it did not erase what had happened. It simply placed it deeper into the foundation, where it would remain, unseen but intact. And somewhere in a secured facility, evidence once collected with limited hope now rested as proof of a truth finally spoken. The same material that had waited silently for decades now existed as testimony, its purpose fulfilled. Science had not rewritten history. It had only revealed it. The case began as a ringing phone in the early morning hours, a moment of confusion that spiraled into decades of uncertainty. It ended not with a revelation, but with recognition, the acknowledgement that the answer had always existed, patient and unyielding, waiting for the world to develop the language to hear it. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time. This one was not frozen. It was suspended. And when it finally descended back into the present, it did so quietly, without spectacle, carrying with it the weight of years and the reminder that truth does not expire. The community never fully returned to who it had been before 1994. Neither did the family. Neither did the system that learned, too late, what it had been missing. But what remained, after the noise faded and the story settled, was something steadier than closure. The knowledge that even the longest silence can be broken, that even decades later, the past can still be held accountable, and that some stories, once finally told, do not ask to be remembered loudly. Only truthfully. Years after the verdict, after the appeals had been exhausted and the headlines had dissolved into archived links, the case still surfaced in unexpected ways, not loudly, not urgently, but like a low-frequency hum that never fully disappears. It emerged in quiet rooms where investigators studied old files, in late-night conversations where the past felt closer than it should have, in the uneasy recognition that some truths, once uncovered, continue to cast shadows long after they are named. The evidence remained preserved, no longer as a question, but as a record, sealed, catalogued, complete. What had once been a fragile hope inside a plastic bag was now a definitive marker of accountability. Yet even in its final form, it carried a reminder that certainty does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. It waits. It endures neglect, skepticism, and time itself. For the family, memory evolved into something steadier. They no longer searched the past for alternate endings. They spoke of the victim in the present tense, as someone remembered rather than someone unresolved. The case no longer dominated their identity, but it shaped it, an unchosen inheritance that taught them the cost of patience and the limits of justice. In the justice system, the case lingered as a reference point for restraint as much as for power. It stood as proof that science could reach back and correct history, but also as a warning that every reach must be measured. The lesson was no longer about catching someone. It was about responsibility, to the dead, to the living, and to the future. The town moved forward as towns always do, reshaping itself around new concerns, new stories, new fears. But beneath the surface, the case remained embedded, a fixed coordinate in local memory. It had altered the community's sense of safety, of familiarity, of what it meant to truly know the people around you. And beyond this one story, others waited. Boxes remained on shelves. Names lingered in databases. Lives interrupted long ago still hovered at the edge of resolution, dependent on chance, technology, and the willingness to look backward instead of away. The California case did not solve them. It only proved that waiting was not the same as ending. Time continued its steady advance, indifferent to verdicts and discoveries. But it no longer held exclusive power over the truth. The past, once thought immovable, had been forced to answer. Not completely. Not cleanly. But enough to change how silence was understood. Because silence, in the end, had not protected the truth. It had only delayed its arrival. And somewhere between the ringing phone of 1994 and the quiet paperwork of decades later, the case revealed its final meaning, not that every mystery can be solved, but that even the longest unsolved stories are still listening, waiting for the moment when the world is finally ready to hear them. What lingered after everything else faded was not the verdict, not the science, not even the name attached to the crime, but the unsettling awareness of how close the truth had always been. It had lived alongside ordinary days, hidden beneath routines so familiar they escaped notice, moving through the same years as everyone else, untouched by suspicion, protected by the simple fact that the right questions had not yet learned how to be asked. The case had taught an uncomfortable lesson about time, not as a healer, but as a concealer. Years did not erase what happened. They only layered it beneath new memories, new identities, new assumptions. The past did not disappear. It adapted. It learned how to wait. In quiet moments, investigators acknowledged what the files never could. That the difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved one is sometimes no more than a decade of technological progress. That justice is not always absent, sometimes it is simply premature. That certainty, delayed long enough, begins to feel like myth. The family understood this in a way no courtroom ever could. They had lived inside the delay. They had measured time not in years but in unanswered questions, in holidays that arrived incomplete, in milestones permanently marked by absence. The arrest had not returned what was taken. It had only named what had been stolen. Across the country, other families watched the story with a quiet intensity, recognizing themselves in its long silence. Some would eventually receive answers of their own. Others would not. The California case did not promise fairness. It offered only possibility, fragile, conditional, and unevenly distributed. The convicted individual, now fully absorbed into the system they had evaded for so long, became less a person than a reference point. Another example. Another citation. Another reminder that the distance between ordinary life and irreversible harm can be terrifyingly small. As technology continued to evolve, so did the tension it created. The power to identify, to trace, to expose grew faster than society's comfort with being known. The case existed at the center of that tension, a reminder that progress rarely arrives without consequence. And still, the most haunting truth remained the simplest one. That the night in 1994 did not announce itself as history. It arrived quietly, without spectacle, without warning, and then waited patiently while the world caught up. Cold cases are often framed as failures. This one resisted that label. It was not a failure of effort. It was a collision between violence and limitation, resolved only when the tools finally matched the truth they were meant to uncover. In the end, the case did not ask to be remembered as a triumph. It asked to be remembered as a warning. That silence is not safety. That time is not forgiveness. and that some answers, no matter how long they wait, will eventually insist on being found. By the time the story reached this point, it no longer belonged to the people who had lived it firsthand. It had slipped into a wider current, carried by retellings, by references, by the quiet authority of something that had survived scrutiny and time. The case had become less about a single act of violence and more about the long shadow it cast, stretching across generations that had never known the world as it was in 1994. Those who encountered the story late often assumed inevitability, as if the ending had always been guaranteed, as if science had been quietly approaching the truth with steady confidence. But inevitability was an illusion. For decades, the case had teetered on the edge of disappearance, vulnerable to budget cuts, lost evidence, fading institutional memory. One misstep, one discarded box, one decision to stop looking, and the answer would have vanished forever. Investigators who understood that fragility spoke of the case with restraint. They did not frame it as destiny fulfilled. They framed it as chance narrowly avoided. A reminder that progress is not automatic, that it depends on people choosing preservation over convenience, patience over closure, uncertainty over the comfort of forgetting. The family carried that understanding forward. They knew how close the truth had come to being lost, how easily the story could have ended as a footnote instead of a finding. Their gratitude was quiet, tempered by the knowledge that effort does not always result in justice, and justice, when it arrives, rarely feels proportional to the cost of waiting. In the cultural imagination, the case continued to drift, resurfacing whenever discussions turned to cold cases, to DNA, to the ethics of reaching backward through time. It was cited, debated, reframed, its edges smoothed by repetition. Each retelling added distance, transforming lived trauma into narrative, narrative into lesson. Yet beneath the abstraction, the core remained unchanged. A life interrupted. A community unsettled. A truth delayed but not denied. No amount of analysis could make those facts smaller. The night itself, the one that started everything, remained stubbornly ordinary in memory. No storm. No warning. Just a sequence of moments that felt insignificant until they weren't. That ordinariness was what made the case endure. It refused the comfort of believing that horror announces itself clearly. And so the story settled into its final shape, not as an answer, but as a boundary. A line marking how far justice can stretch, and where it begins to strain. It showed what persistence could achieve, and what it could not repair. In that sense, the case never truly ended. It simply reached the point where it no longer needed to prove itself. What remained was the quiet understanding that some truths do not arrive in time to save anyone. Only in time to be acknowledged. What endured beyond everything else was not the case file, not the verdict, not even the science that finally unlocked it, but the altered way people understood waiting. Waiting was no longer passive. It was no longer empty. It had become an active state, heavy with possibility, charged with the knowledge that answers might exist long before they are reachable. The story had begun as a local shock, a rupture confined to a single address, a single morning. Over time, it expanded outward, touching institutions, reshaping methods, unsettling assumptions that had once felt solid. By the end, it no longer belonged to one family or one town. It had become part of a larger reckoning with how societies remember, preserve, and eventually confront what they failed to solve the first time. Those who studied the case later often missed its most unsettling lesson. It was not that science would always win. It was that truth does not need urgency to survive. It can endure neglect. It can remain dormant. It can outlast disbelief. And when it resurfaces, it does so without regard for comfort or timing. The family carried forward with a quieter strength, no longer defined by pursuit, but by survival. Their grief had been reshaped, not resolved. It had edges now. Limits. A form they could live alongside. The absence remained permanent, but it was no longer untethered, no longer floating without explanation. In the justice system, the case became a quiet pressure point, a reminder embedded in policy and practice. Evidence rooms were treated with more reverence. Old cases were spoken of with less finality. The phrase, unsolved, lost some of its authority. It no longer meant finished. And still, there were no illusions. Not every story would receive this ending. Many would remain suspended forever, their answers degraded, discarded, or simply never collected. The California case did not redeem the system. It exposed both its potential and its limits. The night in 1994 remained unchanged in its details, fixed and unmovable. What changed was everything that followed. The way silence was interpreted. The way time was understood. The way justice was imagined, not as a moment, but as a long, uneven process that sometimes arrives too late to heal, but not too late to matter. In the end, the case left behind no celebration, no clean moral, no sense of triumph. It left behind awareness. A sober understanding that the past does not loosen its grip simply because years pass. It waits. It watches. And eventually, when the world is capable of listening, it speaks. Even after the microphones were turned off and the files were archived again, the case continued to exist in quieter places, in pauses between conversations, in the way certain names caused rooms to still, in the way officers lingered a second longer beside evidence lockers that held other boxes. Other years, other unanswered questions. The solved case did not close a door. It cracked open many others, letting cold air spill into corridors that had grown too comfortable with dust and resignation. Some nights, former investigators admitted they still replayed the timeline in their heads, not searching for what they missed, but confronting the version of themselves who once believed time would erase the need to look harder. They remembered the confidence of youth, the certainty that effort alone equaled justice, the assumption that if answers mattered, they would surface quickly. The case dismantled that belief with surgical precision. The community changed in subtler ways. Parents locked doors earlier. Neighbors learned each other's routines with sharper attention. Not from fear, but from awareness. The past had demonstrated that danger does not announce itself, that ordinary days can carry hidden fractures, that the line between safety and catastrophe is thinner than anyone likes to admit. Media attention eventually faded, as it always does, but the story left behind a residue. Students studied it in criminology lectures. Lab technicians referenced it during training. Detectives used it as a cautionary tale, not of failure, but of patience stretched across decades. It became proof that persistence is not loud. It does not trend. It waits. There were moments when the resolution felt incomplete, when questions lingered at the edges of the truth. Why that day? Why that place? Why no one heard what mattered when it mattered most? Those questions never found answers, and perhaps they never will. The case offered closure without clarity, accountability without understanding, an ending that satisfied the law but left the human mind restless. And yet, something fundamental shifted. The past no longer felt sealed. It felt accessible, vulnerable to inquiry, exposed to tools not yet invented, methods not yet imagined. Time, once the enemy of justice, had become an unpredictable ally. In quiet offices, in homes where grief had learned to coexist with routine, in evidence rooms humming softly under fluorescent lights, the lesson remained the same. Nothing truly disappears. Not actions. Not consequences. Not truth. The case from California did not end when the arrest was made, nor when the sentence was delivered. It ended only in the sense that a question finally stopped echoing unanswered. What remained was the knowledge that every cold case is not a relic, but a suspended conversation, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hear it clearly. And somewhere, in a box not yet reopened, another story waits.